Hello, this is Stephen Taylor, one of the moderators who is responsible for the Level 7 CIPD learning scheme. And I'm going to talk to you today about the assignments for 7C001 for 2024 to 2025. Next slide, please. So this is work and working lives in a changing business environment. The unit which starts by looking at the business environment developments in the wider world as they affect HR and people management in organizations. And then the second half is about some of the consequences of that change management, equality and diversity, well-being, and so on. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to do to start with is give you some general guidance on how to approach the assessment for this module. And then we will look at the particular questions that we've asked this year. And again, I'll say a little bit about each of those, hopefully some helpful guidance for you. Next slide, please. So this is one of the 4 core units, the compulsory units, which everybody studying the CIPD Level 7 qualification has a go at. And there are 2 which are assignment based, and then there's one that's skills oriented and one that's a project. This is one of the modules which is assignment based. It's about testing your knowledge, your understanding, your ability to do things with that knowledge and understanding. So it's essay based. We at CIPD set the assignments, the particular questions each year. And the way it works is that for each of these 2 modules, this one, 7C001 being one, we have 16 separate assessment criteria. That's 4 for each of the main 4 learning outcomes, which have been set out in the learning syllabus. And what happens is that 4 of the 16 questions are chosen for each assessment window. So your own tutor will let you know which are the 4 that are relevant to you. Each of the 4 will come from a different learning outcome, and you will therefore be addressing in some depth 4 specific learning outcomes out of the 16. But it's obviously important that you do all of the learning across all of the different assessment outcomes, assessment criteria, and you're then in a position to further develop the 4 which are chosen for your particular window. Next slide, please. So each of your 4 answers needs to be around 1,000 words in length. There's a little bit of leeway on each of those. It's not precise, but around 1,000 words for each of the 4. So roughly 1,000 words per answer, giving you a total word count of 4,000 words. But there is a little bit of leeway there. You can go over or under by 10%, and all your references can be excluded from that tally. So you could go up to 4,400, and that would be fine, excluding references. What we're really looking for at level 7 is depth and breadth of knowledge. It's all revolves around the 4 learning outcomes and the 16 assessment criteria. But really what we need to see you do is develop answers, arguments, which demonstrate to us that you have depth and breadth of relevant professional knowledge. And we are also, because it's level 7, it's master's level, M level, we are looking for you to demonstrate intellectual confidence. We want you to develop arguments. We don't want you simply to summarize your reading. We want you to do stuff with the reading that you've done. So we want you to say, this is what I think. This is why I have come to that conclusion. And I'm going to justify my answer with reference to my wider reading. And that may be published research findings, it may be statistics, it may be examples, anything you can find which helps you justify the assertion that you're making. So instead of simply summarizing your reading, which is what a lot of people tend to do. It's kind of the default position. To, to do well, we really need you to do more than that. We need you to actually say what you think and then use the reading you've done to justify the argument that you are going to develop. That is the key to doing well at level 7. And it's important you therefore do cite your sources. It's important that these are robust and credible and authoritative sources, as that will give authority to your argument. Next slide, please. So what we're looking for, what you need to demonstrate through your assignment, if you possibly can, is first of all that you've become an independent learner, that you're able to find your own sources. You're able to go online, go to the databases, find the papers, find good sources of robust information, not just simply read what you're told to read by your tutor, but you can go beyond that. You can dig out, delve into the huge mass of information that's available online, find the good stuff, find the robust stuff, and use that to justify your arguments. We want you to be therefore well informed. When we're reading your assignment, we want to know this is well informed. This learner really knows what they're talking about. They've read widely enough to be confident about what they're talking about. They've made connections between the questions and their wider reading. All of that is really important. We also, as I said previously, really want to see you developing an argument, developing an original argument, that you're not just repeating what somebody else has said, not just summarizing your reading, but you are developing your own argument. You're saying, this is what I think about the big, major professional issues of our time, and this is why I have reached the conclusions I have. In terms of presentation and so on, we're not looking for anything more than a very solid professional writing style. It doesn't need to be particularly academic in its style. Doesn't need to be particularly flowery or anything of that kind. Basic, concise, plain English, the sort of writing that you would expect to find in any kind of modern business environment. We have the next slide, please. Okay, so what I'm now going to do is give you some specific pointers on each of the 16 questions that we have set for 2024 to 2025. Um, I'm not going to tell you exactly what we're looking for, but I'm going to give you some general advice. And anyway, the whole basis of level 7 really is that we are looking for original answers. So I can't say, this is the model answer, because what we're really looking for is your own thoughts and your own justification for your thoughts. And that's not something that you can say, well, here's a model answer. But I can give you some pointers, I hope, and some suggestions. Okay, can we have the next slide? So the first of the 16 questions is about globalization. It's the assessment criteria. You'll see on each of the slides that I've set out the assessment criteria. So this one is assess globalization and its long-term significance for work and employment. And the particular question for this year is assess the trend towards greater globalization of international business activity and consider whether this has now peaked and there will be reduced globalization in the future. Justify your answer. Okay, so what does this question asking you to do? Well, it's asking you to speculate about the future. There are a lot of people who do argue that we have entering, or we have entered, or are about to enter, a period in which the rate of growth of globalization, of course, there are different ways of defining the term globalization, but the rate at which it is growing is going to slow down. And some argue that we have peaked, that it's reached the maximum, and that it's now going to retract. In other words, there's going to be less globalization in the future than we have been used to over the last 10 or 15 years. And we really want you with this question to speculate, but in an informed way about that debate. So we want you to be credible, and we want you to show an understanding of current developments, particularly in the field of international trade and trade agreements, and the enormous changes that are occurring there, particularly in respect of China and Chinese imports into Western countries, into the United States, into Europe, which are a major issue of political concern. And it's not yet at all clear how that's going to pan out over the next 10, 15 years. So we want you to speculate really about that. Um, I think it's also important to say that a good answer to this question will show an awareness of the drivers of greater globalization, because you can only really speculate about the future if you understand why we've had greater globalization in the past. And there are a number of reasons for it. It's partly about technology. It's partly about transportation technology. It's about the World Wide Web. It's about the internet. It's about fiber optic cables and satellite communication and so on, which makes it far cheaper, easier to access international markets. Basically, anybody now can sell anything to anybody else anywhere in the world, and the communication and the information and so on that's transmitted associated with those business activities so much less expensive than used to be the case. Similarly, we can ship goods around the world in container ships, on jet aircraft, remarkably quickly. And this again has all facilitated international business. So it's partly about tech, but it's also importantly and less excitingly, less glamorously, about government action. Governments have, in the main, around the world, over the last 30, 40 years, promoted greater globalization. They've allowed much freer movement of capital, freer movement of people, and there has been a very considerable growth in international companies, foreign direct investment, in the extent to which we trade between different countries, in terms of tourism, in terms of my trade, higher education. It's globalized so much in recent years. A lot of this has been facilitated by government. Now, I would have thought a good answer to this question would speculate on both of those aspects, the tech and the government. And that's where you get the debate about whether international business activity, globalization, has peaked or not. Whatever argument you come up with, justify it. Use statistics, use research findings, use examples to justify your argument. Don't just make points, but justify the points you're making. That is the key. We need to be persuaded of your argument. Question number 2. Next slide. Okay, so moving on now to technology, other really major developments, or set of developments in our business environment, and that is this is just one of the learning outcomes which concerns technology. But this one's about the future impact of technological trends on working life. And the particular question that we have for you this year is critically evaluate whether advancing technologies, and particularly artificial intelligence, will soon destroy a good proportion of existing jobs, leaving many people either unemployed or underemployed. And again, then a requirement to justify your answer with reference to examples, in this case, specific examples. Now, I think the key thing really here is to separate job destruction with leaving people unemployed or underemployed, because the two things are not necessarily the same thing. It may well be that technologies over the next 10 or 15 years are going to destroy a good proportion of existing jobs. But that doesn't mean to say that it's going to necessarily leave people unemployed or underemployed, because new jobs will emerge to take the place of the old jobs. Now, there is a debate over whether that actually will happen or won't happen, but that's always happened in the past. You look at all the technological developments of the 20th century. They created all kinds of new jobs while at the same time destroying all kinds of old jobs. In other words, the economy adapted to the new technology, and that may well be something that happens in the future. So don't just assume that job destruction means higher unemployment. Not the case. Now, this particular question asks you particularly to speculate about artificial intelligence. So a good answer here is going to be familiar with contemporary developments in artificial intelligence. I think particularly generative artificial intelligence, which is the big current development, which is rapidly becoming extraordinary in terms of what it can achieve, create great productivity opportunities for organizations. And it may well lead to underemployment. It may lead to some unemployment. It's too early to tell. We don't know, but we'd like you to speculate and to give examples and to justify the argument that you come up with. Next slide, please. So moving on now to demographic trends. This is assessment criteria 1.3, which is all about social and demographic trends. And for this year, the question is, what do you consider to be the most significant current demographic trend affecting your country? Justify your choice and then evaluate its significance for labour markets, employment, and the world of work. Well, depending on which country you're based in, of course, there will be different demographic trends that are affecting you in different ways. I guess the two that I would expect most people to choose would be one of either the trend towards a population aging, an older population, largely because of falling birth rates a few years ago, and generally low birth rates. At the same time, that mortality rates are falling, people are living longer. So we're having a situation where people are living longer, more productive lives, retiring a little later, and therefore we have an issue relating to population aging. And the other one, of course, the big issue of migration patterns. They vary from country to country enormously, but it's become a big political issue in a lot of countries around the world. So choose which you think, in your view, is the most important current one. Explain why you think that's the most important current trend, and then go on to give some ideas about its significance, its impact on the labour market, its impact on employment, its impact on the world of work. That will obviously depend very much on the trend that you choose. Again, we want you to be authoritative, we want you to set out an argument, and we want you to justify your argument. Next slide, please. So moving on now to economic trends. This is assessment criteria 1.4. And the question this year is, what is the most important long-term economic trend currently affecting your country? Justify your answer and appraise the significance of this for your industry now and in the future. So quite a similar question to the last one, in that it's first asking you to identify what you consider to be the most important contemporary long-term economic trend in your country's environment, to explain why you think that's the most important, and then to go on and appraise its significance. But for this one, we specifically want to focus on your industry, the sector in which you work, when appraising its significance. Now, there are, again, lots of possible choices here. We could talk about economic growth or patterns of economic growth, or perhaps potentially lack of growth. We could talk about growing inequality. We can talk about the whole way that industries are restructuring all around the world. We could talk about patterns of overseas trade. You choose what you think is the most important one and explain why you think it's the most important one. And then go on to talk about your particular industry, your sector. It doesn't have to necessarily be employment related, what you write for this one. The question is phrased slightly more broadly. But I think for an HR people management qualification, we would expect some discussion, at least, of the employment related aspects. And again, justify your answer. You're discussing, appraising the significance of the trend, and then explaining it. Don't just assume that the reader will naturally observe the significance. You need to spell it out. That is what this question is asking. Why is your trend going to be significant for your industry? State the reasons. Okay, that's question 4. Can we have the next slide? And moving on now to assessment criteria 2.1, which is again focused on technology in various different shapes and forms. Less here about the macro picture, more the more specifics. And the question we've asked this year is a very specific one about HR. Evaluate how technological developments are currently affecting the practice of recruitment and selection in organizations. Drawing on examples from your own experience and reading, explain why these developments are occurring and what benefits flow from them for employers. So we're not here actually asking for you to critique the developments. We're not asking you to focus on the negative side. You might acknowledge that there is a negative side, that there are lots of concerns about some of these technologies and the way they're being deployed. But we're actually asking you to demonstrate here what you understand what is happening, why it's happening, and then to talk a little bit about the benefits that flow from them. Write about those. I think the first thing to say here is this assignment refers to recruitment and selection. It's important always to remember that those are two different processes. Recruitment is the process by which you go out into the world trying to encourage people to apply for jobs in your organization. And selection is the process by which you then shortlist, interview, decide which of the applications that you receive are going to be successful or not. And technology is affecting both of those, but differently. So in recruitment, technologies are being used in all kinds of ways, but I mean, the one that's particularly important really is in sourcing candidates. So we have the capacity now for algorithms to search the World Wide Web, to use the big data, and try and find people who would be appropriate for jobs, who can then be recruited. It's effectively turning recruitment selection on its head, really. So it's starting by identifying applications rather than starting with a recruitment advertisement. This is really significant and important. And then for selection, well, there it's being used principally early stages selection to weed people out. So we have technology that reads CVs, that reads application forms. We have technology that delivers personality testing, ability testing. We have technology that will interview people. So you do video-based interviews, but the assessment is all done by machines, not by human beings. And some of these machines can now analyze the way you talk, they can analyze your facial expressions, they can reach all kinds of conclusions about you from the way that you present yourself when being videoed answering questions. Now, there are all kinds of problems, there are all kinds of concerns about these. What we're asking in this question is not so much for that, but for you to explain why they're occurring. So, why is there a demand for these kind of technological applications, and what potential benefits flow from them for employers? It's fairly straightforward, but again, as always, we want you to justify the arguments you make. Question number 6, next slide, please. Okay, so moving on now to public policy. Again, another important part of the syllabus for 7001. Assess any one contemporary public policy development in your country in terms of its likely or potential future impact on work and employment. Justify your answer with reference to example statistics or published research. So a fairly general one, again, asking you to develop an argument, justify it as authoritatively as you can. Again, it gives you lots of choice because you just have to select one contemporary public policy development. It's not asking you to pick the most important. You'd have to justify why you think a particular trend is important. So you can choose what you're interested in. You might like to look at immigration policy. You might like to look at all kinds of things in the employment policy area, pensions, welfare, retirement, national living wage, that kind of thing. The whole gamut of education policy, training policy, all of these would be possible choices here. So you have very, very wide choice. Think about its current impact. Think about its future impact. Draw on your reading to explain your views on those questions. Next slide, please. And moving on to question 7, which is more specifically about legal and regulatory issues. And for this year, the question is analyze a major legal development or likely future development in your country and justify a proposal for change in your country's current employment law based on this. Explain what your proposed change would involve, what it would look to achieve, and in what ways it might be contested, either by some employers, employees, or their representatives. Okay, so what we're again looking for really here is understanding of existing employment law in your country, understanding of likely future developments, so what's being proposed, what are the politicians in your country thinking about doing, changing in the broad field of employment law, and we want you to then propose a change of your own. Now, that might be just simply changing something that's currently there, or it might be adapting and changing one of the proposals that you think may be being brought forward in the near future. Again, lots of choice there. And we want you to demonstrate your knowledge and understanding and explain why it might be a good thing, in your view, to introduce this new piece of law, but then also to explain how that might be contested, why not everybody would approve, what kind of arguments might be made against the proposal that you're bringing forward. Okay, so lots of, again, choice really there for question 7. But at the end of the day, we're looking for you to demonstrate understanding of basics of employment law in your country, employment regulation in your country, and to engage in debates about those. Next slide, please. Okay, moving on now to labour market trends. Critically discuss the current state of the major labour markets in which your organisation competes for staff in terms of both demand for and supply of skills. Explain whether these labour markets are loosening, tightening, or stable. How do you anticipate that this situation may change over the next 10 years? Justify your key points with reference to statistics and examples. So here we're focusing very much on the particular labour markets that are relevant for your organisation, and you will operate in a number of different labour markets. Some may be loose, some may be tight, and the direction of travel may be different for different labour markets. So some may be loosening, so it may be becoming easier to find people. Some may be tightening, so skills shortages are on the horizon. It may be a question of stability. Either way, you explain what that is, and then speculate about what is likely to happen in the future. It's informed speculation. And uh, again, justify your points. It's likely statistics will be quite important here. Um, they're very widely available. It's not difficult to find statistics on labour market trends, but also maybe some examples as well. That would help justify the key points in this answer. Next slide, please. Moving on now to change management. Quite a lot on change management in 7C001. This is the first of 2 questions we have this year on change management. And the first one is about the models of change, which are very widely published, very widely understood and known, which are intended to help guide managers when they are embarked on leading change in their organizations. That could be structural change, it could be cultural change, it could be introduction of technology, maybe moving from one premises to another, whatever type of major change we're talking about. And what we want you to do is identify one of those models and critique it from the perspective of contemporary people management specifically. And again, lots of examples, your own experience, your own observations can be used by way of justification. So you can choose whichever model you want to choose. There are 5 or 6 classic models, which are probably good ones to choose. Lewin, Rogers, Cotter. Anyone who's studied change management will be familiar with those models. And then focus specifically on contemporary issues, contemporary people management, things around today. Some of these models are pretty dated now, so we want you to critique them through the lens of contemporary people management challenges. And the practicality. A lot of these models look great in theory, but in practice, how useful are they for as a guide, really, for people leading change processes? We want you to give your view on that question, justify your view. Question 10, next slide, please. So again, this is in the field of change management. Now moving on to the question of resistance to change and sustaining change, getting people to come on board, which is a big challenge often. And the question is, to what extent do you agree that the mantra, people support what they help to create, should underpin the approach taken by managers when they are restructuring their organizations Justify your answer with reference to examples or to your own experience and observations. So we are here focusing on structural change, particular type of change, rather than the cultural sort, structural change, and whether you should involve people in the process of planning the change. Because one of the ways of reducing resistance to change is to involve people in the project so they feel invested in it. It's not something that's being done to them by senior management, but it's us. It's us as an organization who are all together in the process of determining and deciding how restructures should occur. Now, that is a controversial point of view. By no means would all managers accept that we should involve people in restructuring. This is something that's part of management prerogative, and it's not something we should involve people in. But if you want to reduce resistance, well, then involvement is a good thing to have. So we really want you to discuss that dilemma. How much employee involvement should there be? Of course, a lot of organizations do kind of pseudo involvement, where they have consultation exercises. They bring everyone together in a big room and brief them and so on. But actually, often these aren't intended to really involve people. They are going through the act of doing so, pseudo consultation, which can be very damaging in terms of generating cynicism and so on. So we are really here talking about genuine involvement, not just pretend involvement. And again, as always, we discuss that issue and we want you to justify the points that you make in your argument. Next slide, please. Okay, moving on to question 11. So we're here talking about flexibility, and we are particularly in this case going to be looking at 5-day and 4-day working weeks, one of the most important contemporary debates and trends in this field. So we want you to evaluate the current trend for organizations to move from 5-day to 4-day working weeks without reducing employees' pay. Justify your answer with reference to published research and your own thinking in respect of your organization. Well, there's a huge amount of comment on this at the present time. And the truth, of course, is that it's not going to be appropriate at all for all organizations or for all job groups within an organization. It's not practicable to move from 5 days to 4 days. But there are many other situations where it can be done, particularly in situations where you could, through productivity gain, have a situation where people achieve in 4 days what they used to achieve in 5 and have an additional day off each week. Very attractive from the point of view of the employee. And given that it's only appropriate in some industries and some job groups, you get a competitive labour market trend there. If you want to recruit and retain really good people, potentially really productive people, you can get done in 4 days what an average employee would do in 5. Well, this may be actually a win-win for you. Um, Employees benefit by having 3-day weekends, but you benefit too in that you have access to the best people because great people are going to look for 4 days rather than 5 days often when looking for a job. So lots of arguments that you can make one way or the other. There's a lot of research now being published on this, really interesting. And also you can give consideration to which jobs would it or would not be appropriate for you to think about 4-day working weeks in your organization. Next slide, please. So question number 12, moving on here to productivity, creativity, and so on. Assess the contribution of people management professionals in helping their organizations to become more creative and innovative. Justifying your answer with examples, assess the roles played both by organizational culture and human resource management practices in promoting innovation and creativity. Well, innovation and creativity are different things, although we often lump them together and think about them in the same way. Not exactly the same, although they are clearly linked. So do be careful with this assignment to make a distinction between the two and to understand how the promotion of creativity is not necessarily always the same thing as the promotion of innovation. Different types of things are needed. Also note that it is not just about HR policies, but also about the culture of the organization, and the development of those cultures. Much harder, of course, to bring about cultural change than structural change, but over time you can do it. So think about those things. How do we promote innovation? How do we promote creativity? How do we do it through HR policy and practice? And how do we do it through the development of our organizational culture? Again, as always, we want you to justify your answer, give examples, use research findings, make your answer credible. So you're not just saying this is my view, but you're saying this is my view and this is why I've reached that conclusion, that considered conclusion, that thoughtful conclusion after reading the things I've read. Next slide, please. So moving on now to ethics, which is another of the crucial, important areas. And this one focuses this year on values-based recruitment, which is again a very fashionable, very interesting contemporary development in the field of people management. This particular question focuses on the public sector, where values-based recruitment has a specific resonance. You can choose whichever organization you want, whichever type of public sector organization you want. Obviously, it may well vary from country to country. So you might choose health sector, you might choose government, civil service, local government, whatever you want. But what we want you to do is to explain what values-based recruitment would entail in that organization. What would be its advantages and its disadvantages? And there are disadvantages associated with values-based recruitment because you don't necessarily get the best person technically once you start recruiting on the basis of values rather than recruiting on the basis of ability or partly on the basis of values. And then propose one measure that could be swiftly introduced to make the organization's recruitment practices more values based. So that's a very practical suggestion. We want one that would be swiftly introduced, so nothing too elaborate, nothing too expensive, kind of thing that could be done pretty swiftly, a little bit of training, a little bit of thought. What points would you make and justify your answer? Again, as always, we just make recommendations, develop arguments, justify them as best you can. Next slide, please. So moving on now to 14, and we are here talking about the issue of well-being. Now, psychological resilience kind of crosses over quite a few of the learning outcomes. Uh, it's something that we've already discussed or potentially would have discussed in the context of the management of change. What we're doing here is asking about it in the context of employee well-being, and it is psychological resilience particularly, so it is related to well-being. And this one really is an own organization question. So it says explain what the term psychological resilience means in a practical terms, so not just the theory, what it actually means. What would you expect to see in somebody who was psychologically resilient that you would not expect to see in somebody who didn't have those qualities? Evaluate your own organization's activities in the promotion of resilience and set out any one new measure you would like to see adopted that will help people become more psychologically resilient. That's in your organization. And again, justify your answer. Now, some organizations are really hot on this. They're good at well-being. They are giving it a lot of promotion presently. And in those cases, the measure you would suggest would be perhaps different from one where your organization wasn't particularly active in the promotion of psychological resilience. So you need to tailor your answer here really according to where your organization is and what you'd like to see happen and why. Again, it's got to be credible. It's got to be something that can be achieved practically. Don't select or argue for a highly elaborate, very costly measure if that's not going to be something that's practical for your organization. So keep it realistic. Look at the research, look at the examples that have been published about this issue, and you should be able to make some good recommendations. Next slide, please. So question 15, now moving on to environmental stability, sustainability, green HRM or green people management. Again, this is a very important contemporary issue, focusing on things in our business environment and bringing them into the organization, trying to make them practical realities within an organization. So a colleague asks you to recommend how your organization could make its activities more green, i.e. environmentally sustainable. Critically evaluate underpinning theory and practice in this area and make recommendations for your organization. So two parts to it. You need to give proper attention to both parts. Some of it's about making recommendations and justifying the recommendations. The rest is a little bit more evaluative, critical thinking about the concept generally. Important really to note here that this is not just specifically about people management. This is about an organization's activities generally, and it's your organization. So what could your organization do which will contribute to greater environmental sustainability? That may be to do with people's behavior, commuting, things of that kind, or it could be something to do with the practical reality of your organization and the way it runs and the resources it uses and so on. Either way, choose something and then evaluate the theory behind it and make some specific recommendations. As always, make it credible, make it achievable, not too massively costly. Must fit within broad business reality. And again, as always, justify the arguments that you're making. And finally, we come to question 16, the next one, where we're looking at equal opportunities, we're looking at EDI, equality, diversity, and inclusion. Critically discuss the view that organizations can never be considered as true equal opportunity employers unless they have in place formal measures to tackle the prevalence of unconscious bias among managers and employees. What kinds of measures would you expect to see in place in an organization that was serious about reducing unconscious bias? Justify your answer with reference to published research. So again, here we are focusing on a major contemporary debate, major contemporary issue in the field of people management. The concept of unconscious bias is itself not without critics. People are very concerned about some of the measures that are being taken place. So you might like to take a critical view of the statement here. You may like to say that's not the case, that an employer can only be an equal opportunity employer if it has formal policies to tackle unconscious bias. You can decide what you like. Most people, I think, would probably agree with the assertion in that question, but you may not wish to do so. There is plenty of research findings, plenty of examples you could draw on that would come to a different conclusion. But then the second part really wants you to focus again on the practicalities. What sort of things do we need to do in organizations in order to demonstrate seriousness about unconscious bias and reducing it? This is largely going to be training and development interventions of one kind or another. But don't just say training events. Talk about what you mean. What would be the content of such training events? What's the precise case that would be included in those in order to get people to think seriously about this issue? Which often they don't. People are often a little bit reluctant to accept that they have unconscious bias. You need to demonstrate in training that that is the case before you can get people to take it seriously. So lots to draw on there. This is a well-researched area, very topical. We want to know what you think about it, and we want to justify your arguments. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so that's the end of my summary, my guide, starting points really for 7001 this year. I hope you found it useful, and I hope that you find the writing of your assignment to be a really fruitful and helpful learning experience. Thank you.